The first thing they smell is the grain burning. The harbor at Ostia, Rome's lifeline on the Tiber mouth, is supposed to smell of tar, river mud, and wet rope, but tonight, in 67 BCE, it smells like a bakery on fire. Salt-stung air carries the crackle of oiled timbers, the resinous bite of pitch, and underneath it all the sour, dusty scent of wheat roasting inside sealed clay. A sentry on the quay blinks against the smoke and for a moment thinks a warehouse lantern has fallen. Then he hears it, not the expected brassy call of a Roman cornu from a patrolling trireme, but the soft, arrhythmic slap of bare feet on planks, the grunt of men hauling, the murmuring creak of oars in leather thole straps. Out in the dark, where the black river empties into a blacker sea, lights move too quickly, too lightly to be Roman warships. Their knives of shadow, low and narrow, sliding between the hulks, Cilician pirate vessels, their prows smeared with pitch to drink the glow of fire instead of reflecting it. On one deck, a man with sun-leathered skin and salt-burned eyes signals with a shuttered lamp. He has done this dance for 20 years along the broken teeth of the Anatolian coast, raiding, escorting, selling his sword to kings and city-states who pretend not to know his name. Tonight, he is in the capital's throat. The objective is brutally simple. Cut the moorings of the grain ships. Torch whatever warships doze at anchor. Seize a handful of officials and merchants valuable enough to ransom. Vanish before dawn turns anonymity into evidence. Time is not measured in hours but in heartbeats. How long until someone in Ostia is brave or foolish enough to run for a horse and carry the alarm upriver to Rome? On the quay, a harbor official, plucked from equestrian politics, not a hardened soldier, fumbles with a half-buckled cuirass, one hand still ink-stained from the tally of cargoes. His stylus lies somewhere underfoot, trampled into the splinters as he shouts orders into the chaos. He cannot see that on one burning hull, amphorae of African grain are exploding one by one in muffled booms, their clay bodies cracking from within as the kernels swell and scorch. Merchants rush down from their lodgings in wool cloaks hastily thrown over nightshirts, voices cracking from sleep as they scream the names of their ships, their captains, their sons. One man watches his entire fortune, 3 big-bellied transports bought with generations of profit, turn into a floating brazier. The sound of the fire on dry planking is strangely intimate, like someone whispering very fast. Inland, in Rome, the city is already a tinderbox of another kind. Tribune benches lean under the weight of petitions from hungry citizens. Senators are warned that the grain arriving from Sicily and Africa is late, that bakers' queues stretch longer each morning. A few days' disruption of the convoys is an inconvenience. A few weeks is a crisis. A few months, with rumors of pirates seen off every promontory, is a recipe for bread riots that no number of lictors can contain. Out on the black water, the raiders move with professional calm. Flaming brands arc up onto Roman hulls. A purple-dyed scarf, pure swagger, pure insult, flutters from one pirate mast. Somewhere a flute plays, high and eerie, as if to prove that the men doing this have time to enjoy themselves. The Roman watch at Ostia, half-armed, half-trained, was built on the assumption that the empire's enemies live out there, beyond its mapped borders. But tonight the enemy is here, in its very inlet, cutting the ropes that tie a million mouths to their bread. If the pirates do their work and melt back into the dawn, their oarholes still dripping Tiber mud, they will leave behind not just charred wood and corpses, but something more dangerous, the sense in the capital that the sea has gone feral. It is from this night that a political fuse begins to burn, one that will end with an emergency law, a near-monarchical command, and a subtle fracture in the Roman Republic. But to see that, we start not with a hero, not with a Senate decree, but with a single scarred object. Centuries later, when archaeologists clear a trench in the silt of Ostia, they find our witness. The amphora is half melted on one side, its clay glazed into a glassy black where some ancient fire licked it too long. Near the neck, against all odds, the stamped inscription survives, the name of a grain contractor, a modest businessman who once bid for the right to feed Rome. I have held one like it in a museum storeroom, fingers tracing letters cut by a hand that never imagined pirates, or senators, or us. Clay, straw-tempered, fired in a rural kiln, then stacked by the hundreds in a ship's belly. It smells faintly of dust even now. From this burned container we can unspool an entire system. Somewhere in Sicily or North Africa, sharecroppers cut wheat under a hard sun, tied by debt to estates owned by absentee Romans. The grain is threshed, winnowed, funneled into sacks, then into jars like this, each sealed with pitched cloth and a stamp that says, "This cargo is under the protection of Rome." From farm to port, along roads patrolled by magistrates and tax collectors, that protection is usually enough. Once loaded onto a ship, though, the Amphora's fate depends on a different kind of power, the ability of a state to make its threats mean something across open water. That charred amphora from Ostia is therefore not just broken pottery, it is a failed promise in physical form. Rome claimed its imperium, its command, reached over coasts and islands, across the entire mare nostrum, our sea. And yet here is a jar that never made it up the Tiber, because on one night a handful of fast boats and experienced raiders proved that the empire's real border did not lie at some line on a map, but somewhere diffuse and shifting out on the black water where pirates row. This is Professor Adrian Lockwell, and in this case file from the archives of humanity, we are going to dissect that failure like a battlefield autopsy, not to gawk at the wound, but to ask what it tells us about power, panic, and the people we label pirates. The question that haunts this amphora is simple to ask and hard to answer. If an empire cannot protect a single jar of grain reaching its capital, where does its power really end? To understand who set this harbor on fire, we have to ask a deceptively simple question: what was a pirate, in the ancient world? The word we inherit, pirate, slides too easily into our minds with images of skull flags and eye patches, the neat villainy of clear criminality. But the Greek term pirates begins life more ambiguously. It comes from pyra, an attempt, a trial, an enterprise. A pirates is someone who tries his luck, who undertakes risky ventures along the blurred edge of war and trade. In the world Thucydides describes, sailing around with armed men, stopping at coastal villages to demand supplies or plunder, is not automatically shameful. He records, almost casually, that early Greeks vigorously turned to piracy, and that it was considered an honorable way for young aristocrats to prove themselves. When guests met, one of the standard icebreakers was literally, "Are you a pirate?" a question we would reserve today for courtroom interrogations, not dinner conversation. The Roman language hardens the category. By the late Republic, a pirate becomes a praetor maritimus, a maritime robber. The term is explicitly criminal. It appears in laws, in speeches before the courts, in Cicero's polished Latin when he denounces the infestation of pirates as a disease of the sea. Where the older Greek word could still blur into adventurer, the Roman term slices more cleanly toward outlaw. Yet even as the words become sharper, the social reality remains gray. Along many coasts in the Bronze and Iron Ages, you do not choose between being a fisherman, a trader, a mercenary, or a raider. You slide along a spectrum depending on season, opportunity, and what the nearby kings will tolerate. A storm ruins the olive harvest. You take a contract escorting a merchant. War breaks out between two states. You rent your ships to the one that pays more, raiding the other supply lines. Peace returns, officially, but your men are still armed and your stomach still empty. You test your luck against a fat grain convoy that technically belongs to no patron you fear. Modern scholarship, reading Thucydides, Polybius, Strabo, and Cicero, tends to draw lines, pirate or merchant, soldier or criminal. But if you sat in a smoky hut above some rocky cove in western Anatolia or the Aegean in 300 BCE, the categories would feel less moral than practical. Can this venture be defended as war? Will anyone powerful claim us as their own if we are caught? Piracy was not a subculture, it was one end of a shared toolkit for survival and profit in a fragmented world. And it is not new when it reaches Ostia. The first great pirate shock, at least in our written record, comes more than a millennium before Ostia, on the shores of Egypt around 1200 BCE. If you walk the walls of the mortuary temple of Ramesses III at Medinet Habu, you see carved there a kind of ancient newspaper headline in stone. Rows of ships, alien to Egyptian eyes, tumble across the sea's surface. Warriors with feathered headdresses stand in their prows, round shields raised. Behind them, ox-drawn wagons carry women and children, bundles of household goods. This is not a raid, it is a migration afloat. The hieroglyphic captions call them sea peoples. In the ruins of cities like Ugarit on the Syrian coast, in destruction layers datable to the same turbulent decades, archaeologists find burned rafters collapsed into storerooms, smashed storage jars, arrowheads lodged in fallen brickwork. Cuneiform letters, baked by the same fires that destroyed their archives, plead for help against enemies arriving by ship, attacking harbors, cutting off trade. Here again, the lifelines are the sea lanes that carry grain, copper, tin, timber, and luxury goods between palace economies. The people striking them are mobile, hard to pin down, and described by those who suffer their attacks simply as enemies. Who were they? Here the debate begins. One school of historians interprets the sea peoples as organized pirate federations, semi-professional maritime bands that had learned to profit from the vulnerabilities of a highly connected but thinly patrolled international system. Palace states, with their centralized granaries and rigid bureaucracies, are rich targets but slow to adapt. When drought, internal strife, or succession crises weaken them, the raiders come, like wolves at the edge of a fenced pasture. Another school argues almost the mirror image. They see the sea peoples less as predators and more as refugees, families uprooted by climate stress, famine, and political collapse on land. They had to move, and the only remaining infrastructure capable of moving large numbers of people quickly was maritime. Ships become not just weapons but lifeboats. Raiding may simply be how you feed a community when every coast you reach is already claimed, every field already owned. In this telling, the sea peoples are less pirates and more displaced persons armed with swords. A third, hybrid view sees these as not mutually exclusive categories. As old kingdoms falter, their fringe mercenaries, men already comfortable with violence at sea, merge with migrating clans. Maritime raiding becomes both survival strategy and geopolitical weapon, sometimes aimed by ambitious warlords, sometimes erupting organically. The very fact that Ramesses III boasts of defeating them suggests that Egyptian power, while strained, still had enough coherence to redirect, settle, or destroy some of these groups along its frontiers. Where such resistance failed, in the Hittite heartland, in coastal city-states, the centralized systems collapsed, replaced by something smaller, poorer, and less connected. What is not in dispute is their choice of targets. Whether we call them pirates, refugees, or both, the sea peoples consistently strike at choke points, harbors, grain depots, coastal cities that serve as nodes in long-distance trade. They do not march inland to besiege strongholds by land so much as sever the arteries that let those strongholds eat. In places that repel them, like Egypt, we can see the state's response in stone and policy, new coastal fortifications, garrisons oriented toward the seaborne threat, a visible militarization of the shoreline. Already, 13 centuries before the pirate raid on Ostia, the Mediterranean teaches a lesson that empires will keep forgetting. If you build a world system dependent on seaborne food and goods, you have also built a world system exquisitely vulnerable to fast, deniable violence at sea. By the time we reach the classical and Hellenistic Mediterranean, piracy is no longer an anomaly, it is baked into the business model of the sea. Imagine that patchwork, Athens with its tribute-paying empire, Sparta guarding its austere land power, Macedon projecting royal fleets, the Ptolemies and Seleucids ruling hybrid kingdoms from Egypt to Syria, island leagues like Rhodes punching above their geographic weight. Each wants ships. Few can afford large, permanent navies in peace. Many turn to a cheaper solution, men who already own hulls and know the currents. Thucydides, looking back, notes with a hint of nostalgia that early Greeks did not yet consider piracy disgraceful. It was acknowledged as a path to wealth and a kind of aristocratic sport. In the Aegean, many islands and coasts, Aetolia, Crete, parts of Cilicia, build their local economies around seasonal raiding. A ship might spend 1 year escorting merchants who pay for protection, the next year ambushing those who refuse. The line between escort fee and loot is a matter of who signs the contract. States begin to formalize this ambiguity. Hellenistic kings quietly contract pirate leaders to harass enemy shipping. They do not write "pirate" in the ledger, of course. Instead they grant privileges, safe harbors, maybe a veneer of titles. When questioned, they can shrug and blame independent elements. These are proto-privateers, centuries before the term exists in English. Their violence is selectively legitimate because a crown nods at it. Rhodes, famed for its merchant fleet and naval prowess, cultivates the opposite reputation, guardian of safe seas, scourge of pirates. Its courts adjudicate maritime disputes, its ships hunt raiders. But Rhodes also has its interests. Inscriptions from Rhodian and Delian marketplaces regulating sea loans and insurance hint at a world where the risk of losing cargo to pirates is factored into business plans. Too much success against piracy might actually destabilize the financial instruments built on that risk. Archaeology fills in what the texts smooth over. Fortified coastal refuges, hidden harbors cut into cliffed shorelines, underwater wrecks whose cargoes suggest sudden, violent loss, together they map organized raiding networks. Yet modern historians disagree on how to name them. Were these men criminals in a world that lacked the bureaucratic reach to suppress them? Or were they, functionally, informal naval auxiliaries, doing for cash and plunder what a poor state could not afford to do with salaried crews? The answer, frustratingly and revealingly, is often both, depending on the week. What makes this morally slippery is not just the raiders' behavior but the state's. When your enemy's convoy disappears off some rocky cape, you raise a cup to Poseidon and quietly send a purse to the men who did it. When your own convoy goes missing to the same cove, you draft a decree denouncing outrageous piracy. The acts, boarding, killing, enslaving, seizing cargo, are identical. Only the flag changes. Rome enters this story not as a righteous policeman, but as a latecomer empire already dependent on the very violence it will later condemn. By the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE, the city of Rome has grown into a monster of appetite. Italian fields cannot reliably feed its swelling urban population, especially when citizen soldiers are away on campaign. Grain comes increasingly from Sicily, North Africa, and, later, Egypt. The annona, the grain dole, ties urban peace directly to maritime security. Miss a few shipments, and you do not just have pricier bread, you have 40,000 angry people in the forum. At the same time, Rome's agrarian economy at home has metastasized into vast latifundia worked by slaves. Those slaves come, in part, from the very raiding and slaving operations that flourish in pirate zones. When Cilician ships sweep down on a coast and carry off villagers, they are not just satisfying their own greed, they are feeding a Roman market that will grind those captives into plantation labor or sell them as domestic servants and gladiators. Roman elites, some of whom privately finance these operations or at least profit from the trade, have a vested interest in not looking too closely at the pirate problem, so long as it stays safely far away. But the geography of Cilicia does not encourage distance. Along the rugged southern coast of Anatolia, steep mountains plunge into the sea, punctuated by coves and inlets that make perfect, almost invisible harbors. From there, fast ships can dart out, hit the main east-west trade routes, and vanish. Plutarch, writing later in his life of Pompey, lingers on the flamboyance of these Cilician pirates: purple clothes, gilded prows, musicians on deck, theatrical ransoms negotiated with a kind of perverse courtesy. He wants them to seem decadent, almost like caricatures of Eastern luxury and Western lawlessness combined. We must read him critically. He writes to magnify Pompey's later triumph, but even hostile witnesses sometimes preserve the texture of what they hate. One of the most famous pirate anecdotes of this era involves a young Roman nobody yet destined for everything, Julius Caesar. In 75 BCE, on his way across the Aegean, Caesar is captured by Cilician pirates. They set his ransom at 20 talents of silver. He laughs at them. "You don't know who you've caught," he reportedly says, and insists they raise it to 50. For over a month, he lives among them, reading his poems aloud, shushing them when they fail to applaud. He jokes, plays games, promises, half in jest and half in deadly earnest, that he will come back and crucify them. When the ransom is paid and he is freed, he does exactly that, or so the story goes. He raises ships from nearby cities, hunts down his former captors, takes back the money he paid, and has them executed, some accounts say with the merciful gesture of cutting their throats before crucifixion. Historians argue about how much of this tale is truth and how much is later propaganda crafted to show Caesar as both charming and implacable. But beneath the drama lies a more systemic question. Was his vengeance an expression of Roman honor culture, in which no insult to a citizen of status can go unanswered? Was it political theater, using pirates as props in his own ascent, demonstrating to patrons and rivals alike that he could protect Roman prestige? Or was it, in a crude way, an attempt to assert the state's monopoly on organized violence at sea, a private initiative in the absence of consistent public enforcement? The fact that a rising noble had to improvise his own anti-pirate campaign at all tells us how entangled Rome still was with unofficial force. For decades, Roman governors and generals had used pirates as convenient tools, to move troops quietly, to harass rivals, to supply slaves off the books. As long as the storm stayed out on the horizons of empire, everyone could pretend it was just weather. But storms move. Now we return to that night at Ostia and to the panic it unleashes upriver in Rome. By dawn, survivors have galloped the 20-odd miles up the Tiber road. In the Forum, beneath the staring marble faces of ancestors, grain merchants whisper of burned hulls. Householders send slaves to check bread prices. The word famine is not yet spoken, but it is felt, an ache in the gut, a tightening in the chest. Rome has lived through shortages before. It knows how quickly a crowd can turn into a mob. In this charged atmosphere, a tribune of the people, Aulus Gabinius, steps forward with a proposal that sounds, to some, like salvation and to others like treason in legal dress. He introduces a law, the Lex Gabinia, that would grant a single man, Pompey the Great, an extraordinary command. Pompey is already a celebrity general, fresh from victories in Spain and against the remnants of Spartacus' revolt. Gabinius' bill would give him control over the entire Mediterranean and the coasts up to 50 miles inland, with the authority to raise a massive fleet and army, to choose legates, to override provincial governors where necessary. In effect, it would put much of Rome's military power, and all of its sea power, in the hands of one individual for 3 years. Panic is the accelerant. Supporters of the law paint the pirates as an existential threat, an infection that has reached the very heart of Rome. Without decisive action, they warn, the grain supply will falter, the urban plebs will riot, and the enemies of Rome will laugh to see her humbled. The image of Ostia in flames is fresh in everyone's mind, even those who only know it from rumor. Senators who dislike Pompey personally, who fear the precedent of such power, find themselves staring out their villa windows at storehouses that may soon be empty. Opposition coalesces around figures like Quintus Lutatius Catullus, who argues that concentrating so much military and financial authority in one man's hands is a step toward kingship. The Roman Republic, after all, is supposed to diffuse power through overlapping magistracies, annual terms, and collective deliberation. To surrender the seas to one imperator feels like tearing up a constitutional safeguard in exchange for a promise. Some skeptics also suggest, then and now, that the pirate threat has been rhetorically inflated. Yes, there have been raids, they concede, but are they truly so organized, so numerous, as to justify this emergency? Or is fear of hunger being deliberately stoked by Pompey's allies to pry open the legal order? We can hear these arguments in the surviving speeches of the time, including Cicero's later defense of Pompey's command. Cicero, ever the tightrope walker between principle and pragmatism, ultimately supports the lex Gabinia, insisting that only Pompey has the combination of virtus, authority, and luck to save Rome's grain. Was he sincerely convinced, or calculating that to oppose a popular savior in a moment of fear would be political suicide? Modern historians split. Some see in Cicero's stance a grim realism. The Republic's institutional tools were simply not up to the task of policing a pan-Mediterranean pirate network. Others see opportunism cloaked in eloquence. In the end, the fear wins. The law passes. Crowds escort Pompey to the assembly with jubilation. Senators who opposed him slink away, some warning in private that they will live to regret this day. Pompey moves with impressive speed. Ancient sources, including Plutarch and Appian, tell us he raises around 500 ships, 120,000 infantry, and 5,000 cavalry. He divides the Mediterranean into sectors, assigning trusted legates to sweep each in turn, pushing the pirates ever inward from both west and east. In just 40 days, we are told, he clears the western basin. Within 3 months, the entire sea is supposedly rid of the pirate scourge. These numbers are almost certainly propagandistic, too neat, too round, but they reflect a real logistical feat. For the first time, one commander coordinates a comprehensive, empire-wide maritime security operation. Yet Pompey's most effective tactic may not be force but politics. Instead of slaughtering every captured pirate, he offers terms. Communities that surrender are resettled inland, away from the temptations and opportunities of the coast, in refounded towns like Soli, which he renames Pompeiopolis with characteristic modesty. There, former pirates are supposed to become farmers, their oars traded for plows. It is a strategy as old as Ramesses III's resettlements and as modern as 20th-century programs to demobilize and reintegrate ex-combatants. Offer a way back into the law, and you both weaken the outlaw bands and bolster your own image as merciful patron. How complete was his victory? Here again, evidence splits. Plutarch's laudatory account speaks as if piracy vanishes from the Mediterranean, eradicated by Pompey's genius. Archaeology and later reports tell a more modest story. Small-scale raiding continues. Local gangs survive in crevices the imperial net cannot quite close. What Pompey destroys is not piracy as a practice but piracy as a large-scale, coordinated, multinational business capable of threatening Rome's main supply lines. Was the crisis he solved truly existential? Or had the threat been magnified in order to justify an unprecedented grant of power? Modern scholars comb through shipwreck data, price fluctuations in grain, scattered references in texts, trying to calibrate the terror of 67 BCE. Their verdict is mixed. There were real disruptions, real dangers. Pirates had indeed ranged alarmingly close to Italy, and the Ostia raid was no mere rumor. But the presentation of the crisis, the way it was framed in law and rhetoric, as a plague that only a single strongman could cure, also served Pompey's interests and those of a political class growing more comfortable with emergency measures. What is certain is that after Pompey, the Roman state begins to speak of the sea the way modern states speak of airspace, as a zone within which only it may legitimately use organized violence. Empire asserts a monopoly not just on dry land but on salt water. To sail with weapons and no Roman commission becomes, officially, not merely dangerous but criminal. Step back from the smoke and amphorae, and a pattern comes into focus. Across centuries, from the Sea Peoples through the Hellenistic raiders to the Cilicians at Ostia, piracy behaves like a stress test for empires. Whenever a state extends its economic reach faster than it extends its capacity to protect that reach, it creates gray zones where violence is outsourced, tolerated, or repackaged as enterprise, until the day it becomes intolerable. Look at the underlying blueprint. First, outsourcing violence. Palace kings hire seaborne bands as mercenaries, Hellenistic rulers cut quiet deals with pirate captains, Roman governors turn a blind eye when raiders supply them with slaves or harass rival provinces. In calm years, these unofficial forces are tools, cheap, deniable, flexible. In crisis years, they metastasize into threats their sponsors can no longer control. Second, economic opportunity and asymmetry. Pirates thrive where there is a stark imbalance between what floats and what rows. A slow, deep-drafted grain convoy heavy with wheat and oil is a gift to men in light, fast hulls who know every inlet. A wealthy, politically central city like Rome, dependent on imports, is a magnet. Impoverished coastal communities, marginalized by inland elites, become recruitment pools. Political fragmentation, a mosaic of city-states, kingdoms, republics, means that no single navy claims or can enforce total order. Each shipowner, each coastal village, conducts its own risk calculation. Third, the moral flip. The same material acts, raiding, enslaving, blockading, extracting tribute, are branded heroic when done under a recognized flag and criminal when done without one. When Athens sends a fleet to collect dues from a rebellious island, that is empire, not piracy. When a private band does the same without Athenian sanction, that is piracy, not war. The sea does not care. The people chained in the dark holds do not care what color the pennant was. The distinction lives in law courts, decrees, and stories told afterward to justify who held the whip. In this light, the late Bronze Age collapses can be read not as the fault of pirates, but as a revelation of systemic fragility. Maritime raiders did not create the droughts, the palace intrigues, the resource bottlenecks. They exposed them. Similarly, in the Hellenistic world, piracy flourished not just because there were bad men in fast boats, but because there was so much wealth moving along the water with so few socially legitimate ways for those on the margins to access it. In Rome's case, the Ostia raid did not invent the Republic's contradictions, it merely lit them in flame against the night. When we ask, were pirates social bandits resisting oppressive states, romantic rebels of the waves, we risk flattering them and ourselves. Some certainly framed themselves that way. Some coastal communities may have seen pirate chiefs as champions against tax collectors. Yet the cargoes taken, grain stolen from other peasants, human beings sold into slavery, fed into the very elite markets that underpinned those oppressive states. Many pirates were not Robin Hoods of the sea, they were mid-level entrepreneurs in a violent supply chain, selling to the highest bidder. When we ask, was Pompey a savior stabilizing trade, or an opportunist leveraging terror to carve out personal hegemony, the answer is also both. His campaign made Mediterranean shipping safer, at least for a time, and spared countless sailors and farmers from predation. It also normalized the idea that in moments of fear, the Republic could hand near-dictatorial power to a single individual, for the common good. The hidden invoice for that safety would be paid later, in civil wars justified by similar logics of emergency. Did piracy cause collapses like the Bronze Age, or simply exploit systems already crumbling from within? Here the model of the stress test is most helpful. A bridge does not fall because a heavy truck crosses it, it falls because its supports were already corroded. The truck reveals the rot. Maritime raiders are those heavy trucks, rolling across the logistical bridges that empires build out of grain, timber, and slaves. When the span holds, the raiders are remembered as nuisances. When it breaks, we retroactively cast them as world destroyers. The cost of Pompey's victory, measured in coin and bodies, was high but bearable for Rome. The longer-term cost, harder to tally, lay in the precedent. Once you have declared that security overrides the normal distribution of power, that one man must be trusted because the sea is dangerous, it becomes easier to say the same about threats on land, about internal enemies, about rival politicians. The Republic survives on paper after 67 BCE, but something subtle has shifted. In the decades to come, men like Caesar and Octavian will argue, implicitly or explicitly, that they too must hold exceptional commands to save the state, from Gauls, from Parthians, from each other. The echoes of the Lex Gabinia can be heard in every later Senatus Consultum Ultimum, every final decree that suspends norms in the name of survival. The human insight under all this is disturbingly simple. The line between outlaw and state agent is not drawn on the water, it is drawn in ink, in assemblies and courts under the pressure of fear. The same hunger that drives a coastal villager to sign on with a pirate crew, because the nets came up empty and the landlord will not wait, drives an urban crowd to cheer as a tribune shreds constitutional safeguards to empower a strongman who promises cheap bread. Empires discover, often too late, that you can defeat pirates and still lose your republic. Our own present is not as far from these waters as we like to think. Off the coast of Somalia in the early 21st century, fishermen and ex-militiamen in fiberglass skiffs began intercepting the great-grandchildren of Roman grain ships, oil tankers and container vessels. They carried AK-47s instead of spears, used GPS instead of stars, but the logic was ancient. A weak coastal government, a glut of demobilized fighters, and some of the richest maritime traffic in the world passing within easy reach, this is Cilicia with satellite phones. International navies eventually responded, convoys were organized, shipboard security tightened. Legal scholars have spent the last 2 decades wrangling over jurisdiction, rights of pursuit, and the status of captured pirates, debates Cicero would recognize. In the Strait of Malacca, in the Gulf of Guinea, the pattern repeats, adjusted for technology and trade. Light, fast boats peel off from muddy inlets to hit slow, deep-drafted vessels. Sometimes the raiders are freelance criminals, sometimes they are off-duty soldiers, coast guards, or insurgents padding incomes. States sponsor, gray zone, maritime actors, fishing militias in the South China Sea, deniable patrol boats, private security contractors aboard merchant ships. Like Hellenistic kings with their plausible deniability, modern governments wink at these forces when they advance territorial claims or commercial interests, then denounce piracy when the same tactics are used against them. Our global supply chains, strings of oil tankers, webs of container ships, undersea cables carrying data, are the modern equivalent of Rome's grain convoys. Interrupt them, and cities, markets, even hospitals wobble. We have built a planetary Ostia, multiplied 1,000-fold. And as before, the real borders of power are not the lines on world maps but the points along these routes where states can and cannot project credible protection. When a tanker is seized in a strait, when a cable is cut on the seabed, we discover where sovereignty thins. The legal language has also evolved in familiar ways. In the name of combating piracy and, more broadly, terrorism and transnational crime, modern states and alliances have passed laws granting executives expanded surveillance, detention, and military powers. Naval task forces operate with mandates that blur peacetime and wartime roles. Public fear of fuel shortages, economic collapse, cyber attacks, make societies more willing to trade oversight for promised security at sea. The same questions historians ask of Pompey's command can be asked of our own emergency measures. How proportionate is the threat? How temporary is the power we grant? Who writes the narrative of danger, and who benefits from its inflation? Borders today are no longer just fences on land. They are choke points at Suez and Panama, GPS corridors airplanes must follow, economic zones staked in the Arctic, routing hubs in server farms. The ancient Mediterranean was a prototype, a basin of interconnected shores whose real map was made of shipping routes and the ability, or inability, of states to police them. When we study ancient piracy, we are not indulging in colorful side stories about lawless men with earrings. We are studying how power behaves whenever it leans heavily on fragile arteries. That Amphora from Ostia, blackened and cracked, poses us the same question it posed the Senate in 67 BCE, when your lifeline across the water is cut, will you respond as a republic, with deliberation and distributed authority, or as a frightened empire reaching for its own Pompey? Each time we face a crisis at a strait, a canal, or a data hub, each time something small and physical breaks and a whole city feels it, we reenact that choice. So, what is the verdict from the archives on pirates and power? Pirates did not just haunt the edges of ancient maps, they drew the real limits of empire. Every time a state chose to tolerate, outsource, or weaponize them, it mortgaged a piece of its own legitimacy. The story of ancient piracy is not primarily about lawless men in fast boats, it is about how far a society will bend its own laws when it feels its throat gripped by distant hands on the oars. Empires fall not when enemies first appear on the horizon, but when fear of those enemies persuades them to dismantle the restraints that kept their own violence accountable. Held up as a mirror to the present, this truth is uncomfortably bright. Today's grey fleets and private security firms, today's emergency decrees and special maritime zones, are our versions of the Lex Gabinia, useful, perhaps even necessary, in moments of acute danger, but also precedents waiting for clever men to cite in darker hours. The raiders' skiff off Somalia and the war canoe at Medinet Habu test not only our hulls but our constitutions. When we decide who counts as a pirate and who counts as a protector, we are also deciding whom we allow to kill on our behalf, with how much oversight, and for how long. I invite you to join the investigation, not as passive listeners but as fellow detectives in this long case. Compare the patterns we have traced here with the news you see about shipping lanes, cyber attacks, and security laws. Ask where your own society has quietly outsourced its violence, where it has tolerated grey actors because they were convenient, and where moments of panic have been used to widen executive power. Share the parallels you notice, the sources you question, the counterexamples that complicate this picture. The archive grows stronger the more minds probe it. And then, step into the moral crossroads this history opens. Imagine you are a senator on the morning after the Ostia raid, the smell of smoke still clinging to the cloaks of the messengers. Grain prices are rising, crowds murmur outside the curia. A colleague proposes a law to give one man sweeping authority over armies and fleets in the name of safety. Do you vote for it, gambling your republic on his virtue, or against it, gambling your people's hunger on the resilience of a system already creaking? Or imagine you are not in Rome at all, but in a poor harbor on a rocky coast, centuries earlier. The nets have been bad for 3 seasons. Tax collectors do not care. A captain you half admire, half fear offers you a place on his ship for the next venture, a pirate that might bring home enough silver to buy seed and tools. You know he has taken slaves before. You know some of the grain he seizes will feed a far-off city that has never heard your village's name. Do you step aboard? These are not questions you can Google. They are questions about where you think power should end, at the shoreline, at the law, at the conscience, and what price you are willing to pay, in security or in restraint, to keep it there. The archives can show you how others answered. The verdict on how we will answer is still unwritten.